This is the AYANEO Retro Mini PC AM02. I've really been interested in this device since it was announced. I've not used mini PCs before, unless you talk about my old school Raspberry Pi, which I've been using in my arcade cabinet for years. I had my eye on a mini PC plenty of times, but I never actually pulled the trigger. But AYANEO has done something really unique here with the design of the AM02, which for the rest of this video, I'll just call the AM2. And that is the form factor. The style of this mini PC is off the charts. It reminds me of an old VHS player or a Nintendo Entertainment System. Not so much that Nintendo would sue them, but you definitely get the feel. You could mount this on a wall or behind your TV or monitor, but I feel like that would be a disservice to the design because this thing looks cool as hell. On the top, we have this really cool screen, which we'll come back to later on in the video. On the left, there's a big open button, and then on the right, a power button. If you press the open button, you can see that a little drawer pops open, and it feels really good. I expected when I closed it to hear like a click to hold it in place, but there's no click. I'm not sure what holds the cover down. Maybe it's a magnet, but it closes flush, and honestly, it's just really satisfying to use. The build quality of this device is fantastic. Underneath that cover, there are two USB 3.2 Type A ports, as well as a single USB 4 Type C port that you can even use to power a monitor. Next to that is a 3.5mm headphone jack, and around the back we have a display port, HDMI, two USB 2.0 Type A ports, as well as two Ethernet jacks. One of those is a gigabit jack. The other is up to 2.5 gigabit. I don't know what you would really use this for. Perhaps it's like to run your home network, but it's cool that it's there anyway. I know I'll never use it. I would have liked to see more Type-C ports on the back of this because a lot more devices that I have use Type-C, and the only one that you have is the one that's under the cover and then the power jack that goes on the back. It comes with a 100-watt power supply that you can plug in. I ended up just using one from Ugreen because I can plug in multiple things at the same time and still power everything. It also comes with everything that you would need to plug it into the wall and everything that you would need to upgrade the internal storage, which if I were going to put more storage on this, I definitely would go with internal storage because the idea of, something like this hanging off the side kind of kills the vibe that this thing has going for it, and I just don't want to do that. All right, back to the top of the AM02. We have this 4-inch touchscreen that by default gives you a bunch of information about your mini PC, including your current frames per second, your TDP, your CPU and GPU load and temperatures, your current storage, fan speeds, the time, the weather. If you tap on TDP, you can go to a screen where you can change the profile that you're currently running. You can switch between AAA games, classic games, retro games, or PC like desktop, like spreadsheet nonsense, all using their iPace software, which I'll get back to in a minute. If you swipe left or right on the display, you can change what information you can see. This is where you can adjust your headphone volume. All in all, it's a really cool feature, though I don't know how much I'd actually use this. If you're sitting at a desk like I am right now, it could be useful, but I see more people probably using this, at least for myself, hooking it up to a TV, and then you can't really see the screen, and if you want to interact with the screen, you'd have to get up in order to touch it anyway, so I don't know how much the screen is really going to add to this, but it looks cool and I like it a lot. Moving on to iPace, there are a couple of ways to get into it. By default, you have an overlay on the bottom right of your main screen, though I ended up turning this off. If you're using a controller, you can hold the right trigger and the right bumper and then press up on the D-pad to bring this up. Here, you can adjust everything that you could from what they call the subscreen and more. And you can switch between your different performance modes. Here you can set your TDP limit, you can activate your performance overlay, which they actually have 2 of them built in. On the next tab down, we have brightness and volume, as well as a few toggles that honestly, I'll probably never use on a mini PC because there's, you've got it plugged into a wall. But iSpace is built with handhelds in mind, so I understand why they are here. The next tab has your Quick Assistant, which is customizable. You can bring it up to your, you can use it to bring up your on-screen keyboard. You can force a game to close, activate joystick mode or FSR, as well as a bunch of optional stuff. The final tab on here lets you update iSpace, bring up your system settings or an FAQ, and then quick access to Windows settings that you might want to be able to change. If you open up your system settings, you're going to have a place to log into your AYANEO account. There's some settings in there for the subscreen, like more importantly on this screen is where you can update your firmware for your subscreen. Next down the line is the performance tab, where you can make all of the adjustments that you want to the various presets. You can adjust frame per second limits, fan configuration. Honestly, for me, a bunch of stuff that I will just leave alone, especially since this is not a portable, so I never really have to think about battery life. So I'll just crank the TDP all the way up to 45 watts all the time and forget about it. Then there's the monitor tab, where you can make your own settings for the performance overlays, which is awesome. What I really love about this is that you get to decide which stats are important to you and only have that information turned on and leave the other stuff off. I love this feature. Under the Startup and Optimization tab, and this is a really important thing, you have the place where you can turn off your desktop overlay, which is this small little bit of information in the bottom right corner of your screen. I ended up turning it off because you get way more information in the performance overlay, and it's just easier to turn this off in the main menu and then turn on and off the performance overlay from your quick access menu. This is followed by a bunch of self-explanatory tabs that I don't want to get into, but I do want to jump over to the controller tab, where you can turn on quick control. I was hoping that you could customize this stuff, but right now you can't. But if you are on the couch and you need to swap windows, you can hit the multitask combo, which I believe is right bumper, right trigger, and then left on the D-pad. And then you can use the mouse with the left joystick and left click with your A button in order to swap between the different things. This makes using Windows when you don't have a mouse and keyboard handy a little bit easier. Although I would suggest that if you are using a device like this, get yourself a Bluetooth mouse or a Bluetooth keyboard to keep nearby, just in case you need it. I'll leave a link to my recommendations down below. Next up is performance. The one that they sent me is the 7840HS with 32 gigs of RAM and 1 terabyte of storage. I am not a benchmark guy, but I do have a few games that have built-in benchmarks. So I ran those games, and here are the results. Starting off with Tomb Raider, or Shadow of the Tomb Raider to be more precise. I was running this game at 900p low settings with Intel XeSS set to balanced, and I was able to get an average frames per second of 77 on the benchmark. For real world settings, I was maintaining around 70 frames per second. The internal temperatures were somewhere in the 80s when I was doing this. Cyberpunk 2077 I had on 900p low settings. Make sure that you go through and everything is actually on low though. My average frames per second was about 65 frames per second in the benchmark, but for real world was a different story. When you can see that it tends to hover somewhere around 50 frames per second during combat. I could cap the frame rate to 30 frames per second and be fine, but I prefer the higher frame rate on a first-person shooter like this, so I leave it uncapped. Batman Arkham City I have running at 1080p, very high settings. I was able to hit an average of 59 frames per second in the benchmark. In a real scenario, playing the actual game, it holds a stable 60 and it never budges. I tried boosting this up to 1440p, but the frame rate did start to dip, so 1080p seems to be the sweet spot for that game. Borderlands 3, I was running at 900p, low settings. I was able to get around 60 frames per second. I was talking to some of the guys on my podcast that know more about benchmarks and stuff like that. They seemed pretty surprised that the performance was landing in this range, especially since I was pushing 45 watts for the TDP to the AM2. They expected it to be higher, but perhaps the chipset just has diminishing returns at high TDP levels. In fact, it pretty much matches what I got on my Lenovo Legion Go, which has the AMD Z1 Extreme chip. That's just about identical to the 7840HS chip that's in this. Both have 8 cores and 16 threads. The performance is pretty comparable. Most of the time, you're going to be bottlenecked at the GPU instead of the CPU. In fact, the games that I was running, they always had headroom for the CPU, but the GPU would be at or near 100% almost all the time. The one thing that handhelds have an advantage over something like this is that they all have screens that you can adjust their refresh rates, or they have VRR. I know people will say you can just get a VRR monitor, but I feel like most people who have a VRR monitor probably aren't hooking them up to mini PCs like this. They're probably hooking them up to, I don't want to say real PC, but I don't know what else to say. I think you guys get what I'm saying. Let me know why I'm wrong in the comments. When these games are running, your fan is going to kick in. I don't have a decibel meter, but it is loud. The pitch or quality of the sound is not super high pitched. It's not super irritating. And I'll be honest, if you're using this, it's probably going to be across the room under your TV, and you'll be playing like game sounds over top of it. But last night, I had it set up right here on my desk. My wife and I were sitting on the couch over there, and I paused the show that we were watching, and we could hear the fan of the mini PC doing whatever it was that it was doing. So I got up, came over, and I pushed the power button in order to put it to sleep. Finally, let's talk about retro games, which are going to play fantastically well on the AM02. 8 and 16-bit games are going to run awesome, all the way up to the PS3 and even some Switch games. They're just going to run really well on this. Not a huge surprise because, as I said before, this is just about equal to the chip that's in the ROG Ally or the Lenovo Legion Go. This thing is obviously going to handle just about everything you throw at it, so for 8 and 16-bit stuff, you're not even going to have to think about it. As far as the higher end stuff, I ended up testing a couple of games. First, Hyrule Warriors on the Wii U at 1080p. Over on the Nintendo Switch, running at 1080p, I was able to run Mario Odyssey, and that was maintaining roughly 52 frames per second. I don't know why it was 52 frames per second. I'm not an emulation guy. I mean, I emulate stuff, but I don't know the real ins and outs about that. So when Russ from Retro Game Core drops his video, make sure that you check out all of the stuff that he'll talk about for retro stuff on here. But the AM02 is very cool, and I'm loading it up with all of my retro games and indie titles, and somewhere in the house, I'm gonna find a TV that I can hook it up to where you can actually see it, and it's not gonna be hidden behind everything. Most of the time that I hook up anything to a TV, I try and hide it. Not this. This looks too cool. There's something about its retro design that I just think is awesome. And you know what else is awesome? This video right here. From the NerdNest, I'm Bill. Stay rad, everybody.